The Apostle Paul has gotten himself into a bit of a jam. The church in Corinth is in turmoil. Apparently some strangers rolled into town and started undermining Paul's teachings about the gospel. Folks in the early church did not know what to believe or whom to trust. Paul is off on one of his missionary journeys, proclaiming the gospel in new places and serving the larger church. He can't turn around every time the church starts to get distracted from their mission or has a problem. So when he can't be with a group in person, he sends a letter to be read aloud in the assembly. Now these strangers who have come to town have a very different view of Jesus than Paul does. A little later on in this letter, Paul will sarcastically call them super apostles before he really lays into them with some judgment. Now these super apostles are bragging about their qualifications, their connections, their worthiness. And the church is tempted away from the gospel that Paul preached by the attractiveness of these messengers and the easiness of the message they preach. For a modern day equivalent, the so-called prosperity gospel will make a good stand-in. The smarmy televangelism that promises God will bless you if you send them money. That wealth is the sign of God's favor and that Jesus just wants you to be happy. Now, whatever these super apostles in ancient Corinth are preaching, it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Paul's letter is meant to set the church straight about what is true. The big showdown will come late in this letter. And here in the 4th chapter, the Apostle Paul has gotten himself into a bit of a jam. How does he protect the church he loves from going down the wrong path when he's already established that bragging about yourself is the kind of thing false teachers do? More simply, how can Paul convince folks that he's got the truth without looking too arrogant? He stays away from himself, focuses on Christ. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. We are not the focus of our faith. The gospel is about Jesus, about revealing the steadfast love of God. The gospel is that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, and through his death and resurrection, we are restored to right relationship with God. And although broken relationships and death still influence this world, in Christ they no longer have the final word. The final word on us belongs to Jesus, our Lord. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shone in our hearts and given the light of knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And our task as disciples, as followers of Jesus Christ, is to follow the light which shines in the darkness. And our knowledge of the gospel is the treasure that we carry. And that treasure is a free gift, entrusted to us even though we are not worthy of it. We have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. The bearers do not match the glory of what we carry. In Paul's time, clay jars were purely utilitarian. They were not repaired but thrown away. Shoeboxes, basically. Or like an off-brand storage container for leftovers, the kind where if the food goes bad, you don't bother to wash it, you just dump it, the whole thing in the trash, and move on. And we, humble vessels of the gospel that we are filled with the presence of God. And we carry it with us in our own fragility. And the church, whether in ancient Corinth or in Lowell, is tasked with carrying a treasure of which we are not worthy, not on our own strength, but trusting in the strength of God to be with us and support us along the way. It's not up to us. It's up to God. And God is shining His light through us. The Apostle Paul has gotten himself into a bit of a jam because he's laid all this out, but the church is still tempted towards boasting about themselves, about bragging about how great it is to be the Corinthian church, to boast about their own numbers or strength. But that's the message of these super apostles. Paul says we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. The gospel we have been given is not a protection or a shield. It's a calling to go out into the darkness and carry that light with us so that the darkness will not extinguish the light. The gospel is the support that holds us up. It gives us the hope to continue when things are impossibly difficult. Paul was not protected from the sufferings of this world, but he was preserved. And so we can trust that the same gospel that he passed to us, that we pass on to one another, and that we minister out into the world, will not act as a protection that walls us off, but as evidence that God is with us. Because even though this congregation has been through some stuff over our history, we are still here. We are still putting our faith into practice when it would be easier to just close ourselves in. We are still reaching out into the world even though we have found ourselves burned by it more than once. And that's not evidence of our upstanding moral character. That's not evidence that we know something others don't. That's not evidence that we are somehow stronger or more powerful. What it is evidence of is that the extraordinary power of God is at work in this community. Just as it was in Corinth 2 millennia ago, just as it has been in congregations throughout history, just as it will continue to be, what preserves us is not our own abilities, but the power of God at work in us, not we ourselves. And so even as we carry the fragility of clay jars, even as we carry with us the vulnerability of hearts that can break, we know that we are not broken forever. We know that God's strength holds us fast and will not let us go. And thanks be to God for that. Amen.